Welcome everyone. Today we're honored to host Professor Dr. Tang Ling, a lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Melbourne. As an activist, artist, academic, Dr. Tang promotes feminist scholarship through research, teaching, art making, and social engagement. Their book, Burnout Market Feminism, which just came out this year, 2026, at MIT Press, seeks to explain how, although certain forms of market feminism may bring genuine empowerment, the individualistic logic of neoliberalism and the collectivist demands of nationalism, which serve authoritarian governance, ultimately channel such empowerment into narrow path of burnout. So we have encountered Professor Tang and their work on many different occasions. I first came to town through their profoundly intimate reflection on Professor Li Xiaojiang after her passing. Dr. Tang has diligently served on the editorial board of Made in China journal, bringing in high theory with the realistic, political, and effective grounded landscape of the Chinese diaspora. Yixie and I had the great pleasure of having our article reviewed by Dr. Tang, and Up Women community has always been grateful for the knowledge produced by Professor Tang, with whom we share this queer solidarity. With so many different threads tracing back to Dr. Tang, thanks to Joan, we finally got in touch. United Proud Women dedicates its effort to creating not only politics, but also exploring the condition for the possibility of politics. The book Burnout Market Feminism meticulously navigates an underexplored domain. Dr. Tang takes a different approach to neoliberal vernacular life. From the perspective of self-recognition, self-development, and improvement, Dr. Tang draws upon Berland's theory of cruel optimism and our beloved comrade Li Xiaojiang's theory that feminism should be dug out from Minjian to ambitiously and successfully establish a theory focusing on the feminist struggle on the ground. Dr. Tang reminds us that the relationship between nationalism and feminism is not merely antagonistic, as many might assume. In contrast, they innovatively established the new branch of Chinese digital feminism, which demonstrates Dr. Tang's ambition to celebrate diverse feminist practice and decolonize feminist theories. We see Tang carrying on Li Xiaojiang's legacy in feminist theorizing, aiming to capture the nuanced and conflicting gendered subjectivities from the bottom up. Dr. Tang's establishment of this theory generates a theoretical apparatus upon which we understand new experiences amid a contesting, precarious, and queer death drive like burnout economy. We're deeply grateful for the new reality Dr. Tang has created for our community, from the intelligible to the conceptualized knowledge. We're indebted to Tang for their activism, scholarly dedication, and the act and courage shown in surfacing Chinese queer lesbian visibility. And without further ado, we cede the floor to Dr. Tang.
Thank you so much. This is such a generous introduction. I'm like literally really touched. And thank Up Women for promoting feminism and queer diaspora solidarity, but diaspora as well as like having a great influence within the whole Chinese speaking community. I understand how difficult it is to run a community, and hence I'm like extremely grateful. I'm also grateful because it will be my first book talk after the publication of the book. And I understand that this community is also a community of scholar activists like you and me. And so I'm just like so honored and happy to be here. So I'll share my PowerPoint. Just a moment. Is it this? Just a moment. Is it all good? Okay, I'll turn off.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, cool. Okay, I will. Okay, so cool. Oh, okay, so this book is called Burnout Market Feminism, Urban Chinese Businesswomen in the Internet Age. The main body of the book is written during my PhD because it's based on my PhD from 2016 to 2020 at University of Oxford. And then I spent around 2.5 years to do revisions. And to see this publishing through, it's almost like seeing my whole life in the year of 20s coming to fruit. So I'm quite emotional, but also a bit nervous about sharing it because fundamentally I wrote the book in my 20s. And so here are my table of contents. Consists of mainly 6 chapters and then a conclusion. And it's like the conclusion that I revised the most compared to my original PhD thesis of the same title, which is also open access via the internet and different university libraries. So this is a book about the paradoxes of women's phenomenon success in China's online economy, the so-called Xi era of businesswomen in China from 2015 to 2020 coincided with the government's crackdown on feminist and LGBTQ right activism. Women's growing financial success was accompanied by burnout from working extraordinarily long hours to achieve that success. Women navigated their entry into the new digital marketplace by employing the very old and traditional means of traditional femininity to attract and maintain clients and customers by personalizing these relationships. So this book, I gathered stories of women's life in China's digital economy through accumulatively 1 whole year of ethnographic fieldwork from 2017 to 2019. So I came back to China several times during my PhD years and had a fieldwork that lasted for around 6 months in total, nonstop during that 2 years. And so I did interview and ethnography with business women as well as 6 businessmen because when they understand and notice that I come here to study entrepreneurship, they're like, oh, I want to be interviewed too. And then I'm like, okay, sure, let me interview you too. But anyway, so I conducted 44 interviews with businesswomen in Shenzhen and Hefei, mainly Shenzhen and Hefei, but as well as other cities, including Beijing and Chengdu. And my primary focus when I entered the field was on e-commerce companies, but of course, people were doing different types of commerce that are related to the digital economy. And then they were selling their products on Taobao, Tmall, as well as on social media platforms like WeChat. So their business also varied in size with turnovers ranging from 1 million to 500 million RMB per year. So most of these women belong to the middle or upper class in China, the nouveau rich of China's digital economy. And then they have investments in assets, including houses in the city in which they live, but also houses, let's say, in the United States as investment. But trust me, this is not just a book about businesswomen in China. The dreams and struggles of those elite women reflect the broader challenges faced by women who strive for personal achievement and aspire to contribute to the well-being of women and other marginalized groups in market socialism, or what is known as socialism with Chinese characteristic. It is taking place as neoliberalism enters China after the 78 economic reform, signaling the opening up to global capitalism and permission for a market economy. I refrain to hastily condemn this feminist effort in the market as pseudo, corrupted, neoliberal, harmful, basically negative. And I wish to capture the nuance instead of these practices within the authoritarian state that still upholds an evolving socialist rhetoric. So as Black feminist poet and theorist Audre Lorde famously said, the master's tool would never dismantle the master's house. However, is it conceivable to subvert the master's house even slightly by selectively and creatively employing the master's tool? Perhaps the master's tool are not cohesive, but self-conflicting. Maybe the master's house is too vast for the master to maintain complete control. So I've coined the term burnout market feminism to describe the phenomenon that I observed during my fieldwork, where fragments of feminist hope are anchored in business success, but individuals are pushed to self-perpetuating circles of burnout in the pursuit of that tiny little hope. So burnout market feminism resonates with Lauren Berlant's concept of cruel optimism, where the optimism promised by neoliberalism becomes instead the source of cruelty. This type of volatile hope did exist during the years when the rise of the East, especially China, seemed assured, seemed is very important, and the market and the internet provided some space for differences and diversity in the authoritarian state. So what is the internet age? So the context of it is the first 2 terms of Xi Jinping's Xi era's leadership. Because the 3rd term and up till now actually changed a bit, especially in terms of the market position in the internet or digital economy, which I talk about in the conclusion. But during the 2 years of my research, what I realized is that this sense of hope that China is going to take over and China is going to maintain a certain type of liberal market in the illiberal, like politics situation. And so the term internet age was not only referring to the use of digital technology, but also a state-endorsed term denoting economic and political ambition. It corresponds to the China Dream, Xi's signature initiative evolving nationalistic sentiments. So in 2014, CCTV produced a 10-episode documentary titled The Internet Age, showcased the business opportunities facilitated by the internet. It signals first China's transition from a manufacturer-oriented production economy to an innovation-oriented economy. And second, the country's focus in catching up with the West and, of course, achieving the rise of the East and the decline of the West. So it must be understood in the context after the economic reform with the tension between neoliberal economy and illiberal politics. Most research would assume a tight collaboration between the state and capitalism in China, but the relation in itself is, of course, more nuanced and conflicting. So I argue that it is actually in the internet age, after the internet was introduced in China in 1994, and especially as the digital economy became the main driving force after 2012, the tension has become more starkly evident. And so because the market actually depends on bottom-up initiative, but the authoritarian illiberal politics opposes the dissident, and the power is from more bottom, top down. Yes. So in 2015, Jack Ma and Alibaba put forth a notion called the Xi era. And then they said, we know that all women would lead us to a better and brighter future. And we are honored to host so many inspirational women as we work to empower the next generation of female leaders and entrepreneurship in China. This initiative is set under a background of states emphasizing women playing special duty in the family and the official narrative beginning to associate feminism and LGBTQ activism with foreign forces. But Alibaba seemed to strengthen women's role instead, not in family, but in production and leadership. So look at the numbers of women in the digital economy. So in 2020, China's digital economy involved 57 million women in areas like e-commerce or live streaming. Approximately 23.58 million women own Taobao stores. According to Forbes, China is the home to the largest number of self-made female billionaires in the world. In 2021, the Hurun Research Institute reported that China boasted 2/3 of the world's most successful female entrepreneurs, a figure over 3 times that of the US. So under such circumstances, can Xi era be understood as some type of feminism that are critical of neoliberal and capitalism would of course denounce this and say this is so unfeminist, pseudo, and anti-feminist, as seen in most literature in digital feminism in China. But however, is it possible to study it like somehow slightly more differently? And hence, it drives to my research question. Can women thrive and be empowered in the business among the crackdown of feminist activism? How is gender configured in the China's digital economy? And how is that related to the labor relations and nationalistic sentiment? What are the lived experiences of China's middle and upper class business women? How do these business women inform us about feminism theorization in China and beyond? And then comes part one, market feminism. And so basically the main goal of the book, as I said, is to provide a new type of feminist theorizations, especially through this concept, which is the title of the book, Burnout Market Feminism. And so Chinese feminism is generally framed in two major ways. First is 女权主义 or female powerism. It is rooted in civil society, sort of liberal right approach. Or the other, 妇女解放, which is translated to wife-daughter liberation, and it's grounded in Marxist and socialist thoughts and runs through the state feminism practices, even though sometimes sabotage and sometimes with the revolution sort of not executed as it was envisioned back then. And so as generously introduced by our host in Up Women, so I got my idea from Li Xiaojiang and Li Xiaojiang's idea of market feminism, which is also a very important part of the book's theorization. So Li Xiaojiang thinks that feminism in China must be studied under its own context, not to say that civil right approach, 女权主义 or 妇女解放 Marxist feminism is not China specific, but is it possible that we look at feminism when we dig out or define what is feminism? Is it possible that our thoughts are not influenced or predominantly dominated by such schools in the first place? So this is how she sort of calls for her type of looking at what could be considered as feminist in China. So for her, China's specific context is the authoritarian state where spontaneous female consciousness and civil society can only find their space in the market. So it's not just enough to look at Chinese neoliberal transition through the economic reform as simply neoliberal and then criticize it from a majoritarily left or Marxist feminist perspective. So Li Xiaojiang prefers to call her type of feminism 女性主义, which could be translated as femininityism, highlighting women's subjectivity almost in an essentialized form. And this is also why other scholars criticize her afterwards. So to avoid that type of essentialism as a queer feminist, and also in hope of bringing the book to the wider feminist debate and also bringing in burnout market feminism with other types of, let's say, critique on neoliberal feminism, I would use market feminism in this book, which was also first introduced by Professor Tani Bello when she studied Li Xiaojiang's work. So this essentialism for Li Xiaojiang, however, is a reaction against the more sort of like centralized Leninist style social control. So because for Li Xiaojiang, nutritionism is too much influenced by Western feminism and Western civil society paradigm, and it assumes like a dichotomy between the civil society and the state, while failing to recognize the liberal, democratic, and feminist endeavors in the market. Whereas 妇女解放 is inseparable from the Stalinist top-down authoritarianism that was practiced in the Mao era. So hence, the application for socialist feminism, and especially in the form of nostalgia of women's time in the Mao era, is what Li is cautious against. And that was also what Li would think as the primary paradigm when we talk about Marxist feminism or Chinese feminism in the academic debate about Chinese feminism. So it is in this context that Li Xiaojiang sees the feminist hope in the market, but not in the state feminist practices. So she said, women may complain about the reform, but none of us could complain about modernization. Women face a quandary, no self-improvement, no survival. New problems would of course arrive from the reform, but there are also comfortable new things. We'll unpack what are the comfortable new things afterwards. But here, I would also want to strengthen that in the review of Li Xiaojiang's work, I realized that most scholars would recognize how she's, unlike many others, are the proponent and advocate who praises the market reform. But however, what is less researched or less revealed are her books, which are published after 2010s, including this book that I think is very important called Post-utopian Critique. So in Post-utopian Critique, she advocated for a post-utopian approach in pursuit of local theorization of feminism. So typically, critical perspective would often have one utopia. For instance, socialist feminism have one utopia, or socialism as a whole have one utopia, which is communism, socialism in itself. And feminism would also have one utopia, the utopia where we achieve the feminist dream via solidarity. But however, this focus on one utopia, usually in distant space and time, and considering our current world as problematic. And so a lot of the work of socialist and feminist debate is to reveal our current world as problematic, but a world far away as utopic. And she thinks that that's problematic. So because this will perpetuate a circle where immediate needs and realities are neglected for the sake of a distant, rigid, and collective ideal. And she comes from that era who lived through the collective oppression, the Leninist, Stalinist collective oppression. So in other words, the danger of utopia is that it often assumes a singular utopic future where this singularity becomes a site of oppression. Post-utopian demands us not to see hope in the future, which is inherent in the construction in a utopia, but to return to the presences and to seek idealism in our everyday mundane life, however problematic it will be. And so this is basically Li Xiaojiang's contribution, and I think her main contribution to Chinese feminism or feminist theorization at large is that she focused on the documentation of different lived experiences of women, which for her constitute different types of feminisms. And recognizing the liberation brought by the market for her is also different from undulating capitalism. She's not saying that capitalism is just so wonderful. It gives us like opportunity to growth. It's not that simplistic. So she would use and prefer the term 民间 rather than the market, actually. And then for her, there are like two sides to 民间, the mundane and the activist. And the essence of 民间 is the spontaneous and voluntary actions that people take from within and from below. So for her, market feminism is about capturing those heterogeneous and multiple faceted gendered subjectivities. And so she has this 4-volume book series called Let Women Speak for Themselves, in which she documented workers, educators, artists, ethnic minority women, and war survivors. And basically, she's the editor. So the other women just speak for themselves. And for her, this may not create a cohesive way of theorizing what Chinese feminism is. But most importantly, it is these voices that are being documented. If she has taken another perspective, let's say Marxist feminist perspective to begin with, then her eyes would be casted on predominantly female workers to begin with. She wished to cast her eyes as wide as possible and document those subjectivities as fruitful and as diverse as possible. And here, she chose to document those in her ways, in her 民间 or market feminist ways. Oh, coming back, let's contextualize it in this era of the internet era that I studied. And I will just drink a sip of water first. Right, so let's look at the neoliberal transition in China compared to the world. So most of the criticism of neoliberal capitalism from the global north would actually highlight that neoliberalism actually did not bring such a, let's say, growth or sort of improvement in people's life. Why? Because the special century in the United States, let's say, it's actually from 1870 to 1970. It's marked by a significant increase in life expectancy and the introduction of electricity, lighting, motor vehicles, air travel, and more. And those success and those improvements actually cannot be replicated with the information and communication with the ICT revolution. And the ICT revolution coincided with the neoliberal term. So when we see critiques in the global north on the neoliberal transition and in bringing out that the ICT revolution did not bring as much growth as it promised, it's because it actually did not. It was a matter of fact. But however, in China's compressed economy actually coincide with China's neoliberal term. And China's neoliberal term, different from the global north, indeed brought significant improvement in people's living standard. And so that is like sort of the major difference in how we view the neoliberalism in the global north and in China. And then so for Lee, in the 20 years after the onset of the economic reform, we developed 女性 self-recognition and 女性 self-consciousness and 女性 group consciousness. So it's also under those like modernization. So that's why she's kind of like in support of the economic reform, other than just considering economic reform as sabotaging the state feminist agendas. So it's not just about plumbing into the market and become a consumer. It's also about sort of cultivating that self-recognition and self-development with the indeed rapid development and compressed modernity process through that time. So we can look at two examples from my fieldwork. So WX. WX begins her business selling leather bags at university in 2009. So she's actually triggered by her entrepreneur father, who is very disapproval of her relationship with the classmate from rural origin. So my father told me that I could achieve nothing without his financial support. He assumed that my boyfriend was only after his money. I was extremely angry. The only thing we could do is to prove ourselves to him. So they started visiting wholesale bag market in Guangzhou, the city where they studied, and they taking pictures of the items they like and post them online. And then they would only buy the product of the customer purchase from them online, meaning that their business actually need very little investment to begin with. But within the next 3 years, she told me she has earned 1 million and then could afford down payment to purchase an apartment in Shenzhen, where her family was based. And then there's also the story of Sanmu. So Sanmu is also the only name that I didn't anonymize in my entire book because of her activism background, and also because she strengthened that activism background and wanted me to do this. So Sanmu founded Less Plus, the pioneer Lala magazine in China in 2005. By 2012, however, she faced obstacles in civil society approach for two reasons. First, she could not reconcile herself with the misogyny of some gay activists and the disproportionate amount of attention given to gay issues in the LGBTQ activism circle. And second, she reflected on the limitations of these identity politics, identity solidarity-based politics. And then she said in the interview, then what? What good can it do except to bring a group of people together, to stick together and to share? Does it solve any real problem? Is it sustainable for me? And then she suspended the Less Plus magazine and began a master's degree in interactive design at NYU. For her thesis, she designed an online interface to educate women about how to achieve orgasm. So she said, I'm very influenced by feminists who advocate for female orgasm. I thought that's what I should promote in China. it doesn't matter if you're straight or lala, all women needs orgasm. And of course, for people who are familiar with the pro-sex feminist debate, feminist pleasure, women's pleasure is also like the main issue of feminist contentions. So when she returned to China in 2015, she turned her project into a public account on WeChat and secured angel investment. And then here we talk about the good neoliberalism in China. Basically, it's on either individual sort of agency or the more sort of collective civil society endeavors. So for my businesswoman co-respondent, the economic advancement gained through the digital economy provided them with leverage against patriarchal and heteronormative oppressions or expectations. And then they could also sort of do and achieve some feminist citizenship endeavors in that digital economy, but at the cost of burning out. And coming to the second part of my book. And so what is burnout first? So burnout is, of course, this idea from Korean, German cultural critique, Han Pinchul. So Han Pinchul calls the digital neoliberal society a burnout society. And I categorize it into three different characteristics. First is the auto-exploitation, which is basically summarized in this one sentence. The exploiter is simultaneously the exploited. And second, burnout society is a society that heavily depends on the emotions. And so from emotional labor to aesthetic labor, this is something that feminist literature has talked about a lot, and also as well as affective labor. So burnout society is where all those emotions have been of course, individualized and then put under the neoliberal sort of demand. So we need to control our negative emotions. These negative emotions are our personal problems, but also we need to produce ourselves to be productive and to be happy, to be positive, to become that ideal productive and docile workers for the neoliberal economy and neoliberal capitalism. And finally, it's a burnout society where all human values are twisted into relentless pursuit of achievement. And these human values would include freedom, relationship, fun, all the things that we treasure before now needs to sort of be ushered into this pathway of pursuit of different types of achievement. And then in chapter 4, I look at burnout in emotional capitalism and emotional authoritarianism. And so, of course, I first define Alibaba as a space for emotional capitalism, because it is indeed a quite emotional driven e-commerce platform. You need to be performative in that e-commerce platform. A lot of my respondents would need to do online streaming. They need to control, do aesthetic management of their body in order to still perform and be the spokesperson for their products. And also the way we experience communication on Taobao. Of course, hi, what is it that you need? It's the personalized purchase experience that demands a highly investment in the emotional sort of labor. And of course, this character also made Taobao sort of a space that could sort of concentrate and can afford a lot of workers to work in that e-commerce platform compared to sort of more cold presenting e-commerce platforms such as Amazon. You would not feel the similar type of storytelling and emotional laden economic shopping experiencing like other e-commerce platforms that I experience. But also there's emotional authoritarianism, because a lot of my informants would link their business with the China dream. When they produce an umbrella, they wanted to say that, oh, this will be the next Apple in the umbrellas world. We will need to produce the best umbrella so that we can sort of, showcase to the world that China can produce. And then even with the most mundane and everyday sort of everyday business experience, like selling an ice cream, they would need to create a story that's not just sort of leading to a modern and interesting future, but also a storyline that could tell the Chinese version of different innovations. And then, of course, for them, working 996 is actually achievement. If you can work 996, it means that you already have a job, and then you can still contribute to the society, contribute to the growth. And so it's benefiting both the business and the nationalistic goals. And of course, this would create a sort of circle of burning out. But beneath this overwhelmingly positive energy, there's an ambivalent and conflicting emotion that looms. With my research, respondents confidently articulate their feminist practice in interviews. The ethnographic data would reveal a more nuanced and conflicting reality. So other than the interviews, I also just accompanied them in their everyday life, go to banquet with them, visit their homes, and etc. So the interview for me was not just to have that interview, but also to have that access and to pronounce like my research method to them back then. And then it comes to chapter 5 and 6. And 5 is on Shenzhen. So I explored two groups of businesswomen in Shenzhen. One is the middle-aged businesswoman living mainly in Longgang, and the other is the new generation that live mainly in Nanshan. And so let's look at the first group. I would just bring a tissue. I don't know why I'm like having a cold. Just one moment. Okay. So the first group that I introduced are the middle-aged businesswomen in Shenzhen. They live in Longgang district who run business-to-business e-commerce enterprises. So they were born in the late 70s and 80s. And they received mostly domestic education, but they capitalized on the opportunities rising from China's joining WHO, and then positioning China as the world factory. So most of them would be running B2B e-commerce company first, and then trying to start their own brand as China transitioned after the 2008 financial crisis, and then they would be starting their own business after that transition. And a part of the China dream narrative here is that they would say, so I used to produce most of the products for foreign and also renowned foreign companies. Why can't I produce a company that can represent, let's say, Chinese design? Because they've been producing products for so long, so there's also that urgent need for them to transit from producing for like other overseas, especially Japanese or European brands, to starting their own so-called Chinese brands. So, but then I looked at the ethnography and I realized that so this woman rely on excessive success to solidify a rather fragile sense of empowerment. So when we talk about female CEO or female leadership, so it's very common that we talk about something called female leadership. But actually, this is like an oxymoron because the leadership in itself would assume the leadership to be a man. But then to be a female leader in the company, I realized that they need to navigate and perform submission to masculine domination. And for instance, if they are to have an argument with even the people that they employ, sometimes within these arguments, they will be attacked because they are women. And instead of sort of like deliberately saying like, hey, this is not because I am woman, it's because their subordinate didn't do the job correctly or didn't do the job well. Let's say a designer didn't do the job well. And then they would instead sort of neglect and downplay that gender side and to solve and still create what they care the most, which is a harmonious environment in their company, because they believe that such harmonious environment would foster productivity. And in their personal life, they would also talk a lot and gather to talk about how to maintain their marriage. And one of the main topic that they discuss is to give face to their husband through performative submission. For instance, one woman would only be the manager of the company and letting her husband to be in charge of the board. But of course, the entire company knows and understands that it's this businesswoman who's in charge of the entire business. But she needs to give that performative submission to the husband. So in the eyes of people who do not know this company, people would say that she's just a manager who works for the board. And so they need to sort of balance this like the oxymoron of female leadership, because their femininity sort of is understood to be constructed on a compromised ground. And here I also quote Suzanne Choi and Peng Yingming's work, Masculinity Compromised, and are arguing that for these business women, they were experiencing femininity compromised in their everyday life. And then the second group of the businesswomen that I encounter in Shenzhen are born in the late 80s and 90s, many of them in our age. And then they are from China's one-child generation. So this group represents the other side of the Shenzhen, which is not the manufacturer side, but the innovation hub. And then where a lot of entrepreneurs, investors, and bankers in venture capitalist circle would converge. So all of the respondents in the group received tertiary education, with many attending internationally recognized universities like Cambridge, Oxford, University of California. They're from middle class or business class family in the first-tier city, and many of whom hold American, Canadian, or Hong Kong citizenship. And so a common topic which they discuss in these circles are investment migration programs and their flexible Chinese citizenship, as well as diaspora and very international cosmopolitan experiences. And then for them, feminist and LGBTQ issues are actually repackaged as business idea with many types of quite interesting business model emerging. And then they create a women's community centered around consumerism and self-improvement courses like coding or sexual liberation, or even selling products like sex toys, and of course, fashion. And so, and also counseling programs at the time, which we see more sort of often, like now as counseling or psychology becomes so popular, but back then they already had this business idea. So what feminist and LGBTQ informations are often intertwined with cosmopolitan cultural capital. And then many of them actually had queer encounters and experiences. But however, that queer encounter and experiences must be hinged upon that neoliberal success. So I have like a session in this chapter called No Success, No Queer. And I later also turned it into a chapter, basically saying that, well, they could have, and they could sort of explore that queer encounters. And then they would understand people who don't approve of their queer relations as unsophisticated, lacking in taste, do not understand, let's say, the modern world. But however, when they face sort of more realistic struggles, it would revert back to a more traditional heteronormative practice, which is highly sad, because liberation here becomes then a privilege that is tied to economic and cultural capital. And then chapter 6. So chapter 6 is on guanxi. So it focused on the gendered and sexualized guanxi, which is the research that I've been doing since my undergraduate studies. And this is also like how I first began this PhD journey. At the beginning, I only wanted to look at this. It's only later on that I expanded it to the larger issue. And so it focused on gendered, empowered guanxi and inchou, and also, of course, women not as equal participants in this, but also as wives and potential mistresses. So So in this chapter, of course, I first explained how business relations in post-socialist China are ritualized, power-laden, and often involves the consumption of women's bodies. So basically in Yingzhou, it consists of two parts that many of us are familiar with. And first round is the round of banquets. So people sitting together, toasting to each other, but toasting in a highly ritualized format that people would understand who's the most important person in that banquet and who are the lesser important people who are just there to eat, but who are the ones who are like mainly doing business. And but then in the second part of the guanxi ritual, it usually involves like going to, in my field work, it's mainly either massage place or a KTV, and then it will evolve the consumption of women's body. And then you will see hostesses and other types of sex workers sort of entering the space. And so this is basically a site of gendered burnout. Actually, gendered burnout, not just for women participate, but also for some male participate. And with such ritual, we actually see it sort of in contradiction to the heteronormative sort of family structure, because that heteronormative family structure hinged on and is premised on monogamous relationship, right? But however, with such business practice of guanxi, it actually ritualized and institutionalized extramarital relationship, which becomes like the main sort of discussion topic and something that people need to navigate when they come back and discuss with like other business women in their circles. And so middle-aged businesswomen would actually discuss amongst themselves in terms of how to digest such a practice that their husband inevitably would evolve in. And then many of them would instrumentalize their marriage and simply see this as like a business relations and understand what their husband need to do in that intro practice as a part of the business relations. But a lot of that discussion is also done in a highly, I don't know, in silence, in reticence, and in understanding that these are just the hidden roles, instead of having a very thorough discussion. And when they touch on the topic, it's really subtle. It's kind of like, oh, my husband was very much into having fun and could not differentiate business with fun back then, but now he can, something like that. Or it's also in those discussions that they talk about how to performatively give face to their husbands, and also very importantly to maintain their own aesthetic look, which is very sad. And well, young women often navigate those guanxi networks as potential mistresses. And this is also quite interesting because in their own sort of maker, more entrepreneurial, more like young network, this type of banquet has already sort of like transformed a bit. But then because it's in this business world that they need to mingle with also the older generation, so that they need to come to such banquets as very sadly potential mistresses or potential mistresses, that is. And then it is also caught between respectability and sex harassment. And I also talked about my own experience of being sex harassed in my 20s. And I also talked about other things such as like some businesswomen in Shenzhen in our age could insert that I am queer, and hence they will come to me and say like, oh, please interview me. But also it's because they want to make another queer friend. But when I was doing my field work with like the older generation, or when I was doing my field work in Hefei, they wouldn't question my sexuality because queer doesn't come to their mind. And then they would say like, oh, I think you look like some Zhongxing celebrities, which for them also sort of like, they didn't register that these Zhongxing celebrities are queer. But anyway, as the way they didn't register I am queer. And but anyway, the idea here is that we see the market feminism's contingency very clearly in such a ritual, and also the norm of basically guanxi in business, when intimate and professional relationships are harnessed for growth, and the promise of feminist advancement become unstable and volatile rather than structural and durable. Sorry, I don't know why I'm like all of a sudden having an allergy attack.
but I hope it doesn't affect too much. And finally, it goes to conclusion. So for Han Bingzhe, the key to break the circle of burnout is to re-establish a meaningful connection with the others and the world. And but having benefited from the social mobility in the internet age, it's kind of unrealistic to expect people who experience that growth to abandon the focus on growth and achievement. But however, what I realize and what I find quite touching is that they have different expectations for themselves and for their daughters. And then for their daughters, they very much want them to be free and happy rather than to be driven solely by high achievement. Of course, this is debatable because now we understand that many middle and upper class also consider mothering a highly professionalized sort of work. But at the time, this is what I find in my field work. And also, what I want to strengthen and what I sort of revise compared to how I wrote my PhD thesis is that after 2020, China has also changed significantly. So since 2019, the institutional and domestic turbulence has placed the imbalance between illiberal politics and the liberal economy and authoritarianism and neoliberalism. And Jack Ma, who was like extremely sophisticated and influential the way as Elon Musk is now in the world, has also like disappeared and silenced for a bit in China. Even up to today, he's no longer as active as before. And as this crisis deepens, it risks not just the economy, but also the state's legitimacy. So in this context, women's autonomy has also become symbolic for the autonomy of the market. So market in this term is also in a feminized position in China in that market socialism. With neoliberalism failing to deliver its promise, it's clear that people are also beginning to reflect on the circle of voluntarily burn out. So hence we see Ron and lying flat. And also people are critical of like the evolution, right? So these are the new things that people talk about. And then so in the final question that I live in this book is that is it possible that we still could look into market feminism, but the market feminism that can break free from the circle of burning out? And here are like perhaps some new research that I am looking at sort of after this book. Thank you. Sorry about my nose again. Really sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tang, for delivering this extremely interesting, very engaging lecture to us. We're all fascinated by your research. So I guess now we have some prepared questions ourselves, and then we will open up the floor to our audience to raise questions. Okay, so yeah, maybe you can ask the first few questions since I think you've written them, and we want to encourage people who have questions to raise their own voice, and then I can ask 2 or 3 questions as well.
Yes. So Professor Tang, a big fan of your work, and thank you so much for all of your initiatives. I guess my first question is from a standpoint of queer woman, what was the interview process like, and what were some of the memorable moments? Because this book was written so vividly with so many rich stories, and we're just curious to find out what was going on in your mind, or are there any interesting dynamics or stories that you would love to share with the audience?
Right. Thanks so much. I didn't include a lot of stories in the presentation, but thanks for noticing that little stories in the field work. I think looking back, but the field work in itself is like full of different emotions, I would say, because at the time I was also thinking that is it possible that we can actually see some type of like feminism that's so valid and legit and also hope-giving in the field work. And then so I came to the field with a genuine curiosity, and my informants are very, very generous.
Thank you, Professor Tao, for the interesting story. And people are really, if you have not yet read the book, there are so many interesting stories, including lesbian drama and businesswoman
Right,
empowerment.
it's true.
Okay.
It's true.
And the second question, I guess this is more related to the queer world making. So in the end of the book, you mentioned that this book is just the beginning, and we are just wondering, it is the beginning of what? Is that does that have a queer annotation of it, or what do you envision the world to be like for our future?
Well, I think when I was writing the book, to end this book, I was more thinking that now that China is the second economy in the world, and also as the world economy is now being shaken, it's not just like China's economy is being shaken, it's more like globally. And then also the entire world is also imagining a different pathway to grow, right? Because it's after the publication or during my revision, the books about degrowth really like sort of start to grow. And so, or also, if we do not use degrowth because it's more like sort of Marxist, leftist leaning school of thought. And if we just think about donut economic, we're now thinking of like new ways to develop the market that's not just about the capitalism way, which is the growth of the capital, but also like more full-rounded like growth that's more sustainable for the environment, but also for the happiness of individuals. So I was thinking that if the market in itself or the principle of the market can actually deviate from the principle of capitalism, then sorry, then then it may be possible that that we can practice our world in a slightly different way. I had a lot of thinking of what is queerness when I wrote a book, because queerness is not just about digging out stories from LGBTQ. And also at the beginning of my academic career, I didn't want to become like a queer scholar too. I wanted to sort of dig out queer stories from non-queer or non-queer focused areas, because it's not that queer is just, you know, what LGBTQ or what LGBTQ identified people do. In our everyday life, we encounter queer. But what's so queer about it when the queer entrepreneurs who doesn't bother to go to any type of queer gathering because they prefer to spend their time in business gathering rather than queer gathering. It's like their own words. So what's so queer about it, and what's so queer when our heteronormative relationship had already become so calculative? When, you know, marriage become business relations, is it possible to argue that so let's go back to WX story, like one of the very few stories that I looked at. If you dare to kind of like say no to that calculative path, and then to sort of assert and to choose basically who you love, to be true to yourself, it's already at the beginning of queer. But the circle of burning out is that you choose that path only by proving that I'm successful enough to do that. So it's like not so queer to sort of assert that. So I feel like in that realm, to be queer could also just be to not calculate, because it's fundamentally that calculation that leads to burnout. Yeah.
Sorry, you get to ask the next question.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Dr. Tao, for answering these. I have a question regarding the part about burnout that you talk about as your framework. So, since burnout is kind of theorized as a broader condition of neoliberal life, so I'm wondering what is distinctive about burnout market feminism in China? Or in other words, what does this particular conjunction of women's entrepreneurial success combined with authoritarianism that's distinctive in China reveal about the framework of burnout that may not be captured when it first came out as a general condition of contemporary life?
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really the double burden kind of analogy. But here, the double burden is not just a neoliberal like burden, but how our sort of nationalism is also hinged on this neoliberal success of individuals, but also of the nation. And so, if I am to carry the burnout burden as like a lean-in entrepreneur in the United States, I do not need to carry that greater dream of the rejuvenation of the nation. But in China, I feel very strongly that people do carry that. So individual success is not just about individual success. It's also like burning out for for the rejuvenation of for to achieve, Chinese dream collectively. And I feel that adds like an extra a burden to burnout in China. But also like when Han Pingzhou talks about burnout society, and also it's assumed that it's a highly individualistic like society, right? In the way that he writes, and that's in line with the modernization individualism sort of debate or like way of thinking. But however, I think burnout market feminism really in China has all of that. It's highly individualistic, highly calculative, but also the collectivism was there not because of the genuine sort of like collectivity or solidarity, but because of one, nationalism, but second, to manage like a heteronormative sort of like family situation, to manage that harmonious like sort of environment in hope of like producing a productive environment for the family and for others. I think it's like a lot of extra layers compared to Han Pingzhou's like burnout.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I guess my next question is about your field selection. So like Shenzhen, as we all know, it's a pretty like a typical site. Maybe we can imagine that to study like digital rise of China. But what about Hefei? Like why you
Right.
choose Hefei over other
Right.
places in like other smaller like the second tier cities in China? So I'm just curious about your why you did your study there.
Right. So even though this interview would be uploaded to YouTube, but I still want to be like quite honest in the answering this question. I think the official answer have already been given like in the book, but the unofficial answer is just that to study up is not as accessible as to study quote unquote down. Because this is not a group of like people that people can easily have access to just by sending out like an information like survey and say, "Hi, do you want to be interviewed by me?" They'll be like, "I do not have time, friend." They don't even have time to answer. So the short answer is that I happen have I happen to have the access to the field, and so they were generous enough to say. So I happen to know one gatekeeper, and this gatekeeper is very supportive of my career, and because this gatekeeper is one of the have-it-all sort of women, and also highly achieving herself with PhD and tertiary education, like postgraduate education. So she's very supportive. So she brought me to the field of Hefei, and she opened up her world to me. I'm appreciative.
Thank you so much for sharing your honest opinion with us. So now we are towards the end of our prepared questions, so we will open up the floor to our audience. I see there are already questions in the chat, so maybe if we can just go in the order of the question raised. First is Caroline. Please, you can please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, thank you so much for being in the library. So I'm sorry, I don't know how I have to speak up, but yeah, thank you so much for bringing this book to us. And I want to ask about in your book you talk about Li Xiaojiang and Ping Chu Han. So I wonder how these two theories are connected. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. They're not connected before this book. So yeah. The answer is they were not connected before this book. And so at the beginning, I only used Li Xiaojiang's work. Yeah, I only used Li Xiaojiang's work at the beginning because I wanted to, find a Chinese feminism beyond the civil society or Marxist socialist feminist perspective. And then I was struggling with serialization a lot during my PhD. And I encountered Han Pingzhou's work in one of my revisit to China, and it's in a bookshop, in a random city. And I was waiting for my friend, and I started to read Han Pingzhou, and I couldn't stop. So I was like, oh wow! And I was already year 3, like in my PhD, and back then I even failed my confirmation because I didn't come up with like a theoretical perspective that could tie the entire ethnography in. And but I wasn't also thinking so much. But I encountered Han Pingzhou in the bookshop, and it was really kind of like a lightning stroke me. And I feel like, wouldn't it be a great idea if I combine Han Pingzhou and Li Xiaojiang? And so it became like the main focus of the book. So yeah.
Thank you. And next is Jun Zhu. So thanks, Dr. Tang, for sharing your insightful research and findings. According to your theoretical framework, which is based on Li Xiaojiang's market feminism and Han Pingzhou's burnout society, I'm also curious that how would you critically review the connections between Chinese businesswomen and post-feminism, perhaps in terms of women's autonomy, Ling culture, and neoliberalism?
Thank you so much. Yes, I revealed post-feminism, neoliberal feminism, and popular feminism in the book. And I talk about why I didn't use those concepts and instead use market feminism. It's because those concepts basically are concepts that rise after the 90s and with the criticism of like neoliberal, sort of neoliberalism as a whole. And basically these 3 concepts sort of ties neoliberalism, how neoliberalism and feminism, basically how feminism cannot coincide with neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has co-opted feminist sort of discourses to make it like more pseudo. It's more pronounced in post-feminism debate, and it becomes like more sort of dialectical in the later popular feminist debate. But however, these 3 concepts fundamentally are based on just neoliberal economy like situation, whereas the politics situation is like kind of just capitalist liberal democratic societies. And hence how market feminism different from these is that in China it's more market socialism, right? Like we would like to sort of see, or sometimes we see this tight collaboration between illiberal economy and illiberal politics and neoliberal economy, but sometimes there are more tensions. And to capture that tension, I mean, like the rise and fall of Jack Ma exactly captures that tension. And also like how Jack Ma sort of like thought that it is possible to, like promote a very type of linking feminism. It's also kind of like being seen later on as just not possible. So because now if we look at sort of Alibaba's agenda, it's no longer kind of like female leadership. It's more about how women can balance their household chores, reproductive labor by being like a service worker, like or gig worker on the digital economy in Taobao. So now the rhetoric has also changed. So market feminism is more nuanced because it's not necessarily kind of like just neoliberal. Sometimes in that just neoliberal realm, we can also see like some other interpretations of what it means by a woman that's different from what was demanded by the illiberal politics. So I think that's like the main difference. And I elaborate that part quite in detail in my book.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we see another question among the audience. Yeah, Wen Ying, do you wanna unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for the book talk. I learned so much. I just have actually, I have two questions. One is a more methodological question. Another is more pertaining to my own research. I'm just curious about your observation in the field. So for the methodological question, I see that your book draws on the feminist theory, the burnout theory, and the burnout market. So I'm kind of curious, how did you introduce these concepts to your participants or the people you encounter in the field, particularly because feminism is not really a term that receive a lot of good reputation sometimes in more Chinese setting, right? Like in the culture setting, and also how did you balance understanding their experience from that theoretical lens that you have, and their own interpretation?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ellen. Basically, I didn't tell them that this book will be about burnout market feminism because I didn't have the idea back then when I was doing the interview and ethnography. So of course, I just entered the field by saying that I wished to study businesswomen in the digital economy. And then so all my research questions, all my interview questions guides were revolving around how they start a business, how people around them react, and the major sort of turning point in their business, and also their relationships with their family. So these more standard questions. And yeah, so they didn't have an idea of me approaching this as like a queer feminist. This is like what they didn't know, but then what they know of is that I was a PhD student from Oxford and I wanted to study this. And after the interview, I will be observing their life on their social media and their everyday life. So this is what they know. And so I also said I had a lot of thoughts of whether I would be sending my book to them or presenting this book to them. I think it's very challenging. And I write in the acknowledgement that I would never remember times when they sent me to, speed rail station and then they play like a medieval history podcast that's like not related to their business or family life or friendship in any way. It's just because they love medieval history. And it's so beautiful, that moment. And but I can't theorize it, right? It's and so I can't write the time when they when they dance with me in music festival that they take me to, because some of them have music festival business. But just to enjoy music with them, it's also like very beautiful. And I couldn't write those moments in my field work too. So it's actually a hard balance. And even like later on, when I encountered one businesswoman, after my entire field work, and then I know this businesswoman decided not to not to go public with her company and not to become a listed company, even though there are like a lot of investors that trace her to do so. And then the relations that this businesswoman has with her employees, which she employed for more than 10 years, 20 years, she really care about them and treat them as family. And so I feel like if I met this businesswoman in my fieldwork, maybe I would theorize my work slightly more nuanced than what I had done with the work that I presented now. And just because I understand that I presented in a way, especially now that focus a lot on burnout, that I feel and I understand that this is not what they probably would wish. And yeah, this is also like a struggle that I have. But luckily, because of the social positions that they're in, I don't feel that it's a matter of exploitation. So that's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So just a quick update question is a follow-up question is that I study people's perception of support. So I'm just curious, in your observation, does that perception change how they experience the burnout?
What perception?
Just perception of whether or not there's support, or the perception of to run a business in this liberalism, but also nationalistic country, like any perception that caught your eyes.
Right. I think it really has a lot to do with the economy, right? Like when I was doing the research, it was just like so optimistic, and then of course they're so willing to go down pathway of burning out because they can actually gain something. And but however, like I think now the economy is so different. So the perception actually changed like quite significantly for some, but some others still like try to, turn to like smaller business scale and etc. But yeah. But I think for others of course, there's like this collective doubt, not just for businesswomen, but also just a larger like structural feeling that is doubting, like whether growth or achievement is like the only path that people should go to. Otherwise, there wouldn't be like lying flat movement. And so I think that's
Thank you so
pretty my
much.
answer. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Um, I'm a college student that currently studies in the science field, and after reading the book, it does challenge some previous perception I have about how to how to embody feminism in my everyday life. But if it's not about working harder and then gain gain more representative of a female scientist, um like in the industry or
Yeah.
in academia, what else can I do in the everyday life?
Mm. Thank you so much for asking, and thank you so much for reading this as a scientist. I'm just reading I'm just writing my second book on like 25 women who shaped modern China, and one of the women that I write the bio is Wu Shengxiu. Um, and so of course, as a physicist, she represents like the woman that challenged like the world that's like very male dominated, and but however, it's also about like how we perceive what feminism is, right? Like as you said. And I think after writing this book, and also like the first five women that we cover in this new book, me and Shirley Ye, my co-author, are sort of so-called women in the men's world, like women who shape men's world. Like also Hua Mulan, right? It's like does Hua Mulan represent feminism, like women warrior, and basically extraordinarily powerful and wonderful women. And so Hua Mulan's poem also ends with the phrase, the male rabbit and the female rabbit run so fast, side by side together, that we can't distinguish who's the male and who's the female. rabbit. But however, I think now as a feminist, I would ask, like, why are we telling the stories of the rabbit who runs fast? What about the story of the rabbit who doesn't run as fast? Do their story needs like deserve to be told? So I think as a feminist and also thinking a lot on sort of what means to be feminist, if it's not successful, is it solidarity? If it's solidarity, does it mean that to run a very collectivist sort of revolution-oriented community is like the only goal? And what about other ordinary women who doesn't want to, run such things? Then I really comes to a very simple conclusion that is, I think, to be kind is a very feminist thing. And that's actually very rare and hard to do because a lot of the things I think in the crossway of choosing to be kind and compassionate, many people would choose otherwise. To achieve more, to be more excellent, to sacrifice people around us, to sacrifice what we want for the larger good. But I now feel like, what if we don't choose larger good, but just to choose be kind? Yeah. So I think that's kind of like what I was also thinking and trying to write
Oh,
recently.
thank you. It's just I'm trying to ask so I'm in a university in Los Angeles and I'm doing undergrad researches, and since I'm
Right.
like in a science major, I recently came across someone who is I think she's more of an activist, but she's like my age, and she decides to participate in the activism of feminism, but
Right.
actually we think alike a lot, but I'm kind of confused on what well how can we make any difference in the current world, whether it's in China or it's in like Western
Yeah.
countries where you got the right to protest. But even if you got the right to protest, things keeps happening, and like there's very severe like social um prosecution of women, and it just keeps happening everywhere, no matter what country it is. And we're thinking about like what difference can we make? And also as like a I don't know, it's sort of like at this point it becomes like a question similar to the last one. It's just I've been thinking previously I thought to make a difference I would just have to follow the path of like our predecessors. They've become like the first generation of like female professors. We got a lot of female professors in our department right now.
Mm.
But what difference can we make on top of that?
Mm. Right. I think it's also like I've also been thinking on this in terms of what is queer, right? I guess the when we talk about queer temporality, there's also something that predates queer temporality, which is to living the moment. And to living the moment maybe is not to think about like what difference this would make, but just to understand that this will like no matter what pathway we choose, what we do, it will make some differences. Maybe the differences are not in our hands. It doesn't mean like going to activism activities and etc. are not meaningful, but it's just that when it was kind of certain that they would not yield any outcome, I think it's perhaps a good idea to understand that maybe we will just still do things that are other oriented and kind to people around us, and also not sort of like forcing us or people around us to go into like certain trajectories, but also possible to make a difference as time unfolds on its own. And maybe that's some type of queer temporality. And yeah, maybe
Thank
that's not a
you.
great answer, but yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear like your thoughts on this because I read this book, I think when I saw the poster maybe last week, and I spent a couple of hours reading it, and I guess I just really want to know your like opinion on the problems me and my peers are thinking about.
Thanks for reading my book.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't really have a question to ask, but just wanna unmute myself and express my interest in the book and in the talk. And thank you so much for sharing your work. I see a lot of, like I said, interesting things going on. I mean, although I didn't finish reading the book, but I'm also an ethnographer doing my research, so I feel like resonated by a lot of the things you shared, and also by the moments you depicted in the book. So if I have to ask a question, I think in general, maybe something I'm personally also very interested in about this idea of being positive all the time. And you can say it's kind of like this general neoliberal politics, but also I think, this national or state sanctioned idea of positive energy.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you, in your book, if there's anything you want to share about this aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I did have like some sessions on that positive demand, positive energy, harmonious sort of business, 和气生产, harmonious environment would generate like money kind of depictions. And also, yeah, of course it is tiring. And many scholars, I believe, have also been written on that quite extensively. And also Chinese version of happiness, right? Starting from like AQ, and no matter how tough our situation is, as long as we feel the positive, it will become positive in the end. So yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think many others maybe have written on this like more extensively than I do. But I certainly see this like kind of overwhelming positive energy in my field. Yeah.
Thank you.
If not, I think we can also wrap up.
Okay.
We can wrap up this by inviting Professor Tang to maybe conclude with, first of all, some address to the queer general audience by answering the question of what would you say to your queer readers specifically that are maybe not directly addressed from the book, or have you found some preliminary answers to the final question you have raised in this book, how to do feminism without the burnout? And the last question would be, what theories do you find useful nowadays after Hanbin-Cho? And finally, review or maybe give audience a preview of your upcoming work.
Oh, thank you. I mean, first to queer audiences, I think there's a hope that everybody could be queer, right? Especially doing new research. I figured even like living today. So now I'm actually in China, and so I'm now living with my mom. So because it's like non-teaching break at Unimel, and it's very interesting because I have came out like fully to my mom, and my partner is coming like later on this week. My mother loves my partner. And my partner's parents has just met my father in Shenzhen the other day, and it went okay. And so, but people joke, as I come to Unimel, one student came to my office and say, now you represent homonormativity. And the student said that I perpetuate cruel optimism for her. So I've been having a lot of thoughts, especially thinking that many queer research or people are finding like new ways to be homonormative.
Whereas like not having a kid and many of the feminist struggles in China and Asia at large becomes like not having the next generation, right? And so is it possible that there is like some kind of like middle ground and not to put people in that weight to see, oh, who's more normative, who's like less normative. But then is it possible to imagine everybody in, like a more live in the moment sort of situation? And is it also possible to see me with like a highly homonormative life of to be queer too? And what does this homonormativity mean? And do I still get qualified to become queer now that I am so fortunate enough to have a stable job at an institution that people do know of? It's very different. I think this job has changed me entirely. And I was thinking a lot about what queer means. Am I queer enough? Or why am I doubting myself of like my positionality? Do I now have less legitimacy to talk about those stuff? Am I also co-opted? So these are like many things or that I've been thinking of, but also I've been thinking that, but isn't it like nicer if we can all imagine a society where everybody could have like more or less a stable job and a fulfilling job, not a bullshit job. And if one day it is possible, um, yeah, yeah. So I was thinking a lot on that realm, I guess, on queerness. And uh even pursuing homonormative lifestyle could be a privilege. At least there are certain legal, yeah, exactly, such a privilege, right? And also living in Australia, it is a privilege now compared to living in many other places. And so indeed, I was reflecting a lot on my new positionality and am I still legitimate to talk to the queer community? And what are the second questions? Sorry, I was being drifted away. Oh,
Yes. The second question is, have you found some preliminary answer to the question you have raised at the end of the book? That is how to do feminism without burnout.
I think there's another, yes. During revision of the book, I also had a lot of thought about activism and solidarity. Because for like some time, I was joining more hardcore activist communities that strengthen a lot on solidarity. And but I also find exploitation sort of I experience like very embodied struggles in that too. And it's kind of like I also talk about it in the book. There is like an oppression Olympics going on within activist circle too, right? So who is more marginalized, who is more legitimate to speak, and how can I reallocate, like how do we perceive our happiness? Is pursuing like happiness of any type just pseudo or like a champagne socialist or whatever. I was thinking a lot on that. If people don't pursue like achievement or individual advancement of any sort, yeah, I think it's a rather hard it's a hard balance. And also if a collective demands you to sacrifice like constantly, let's say give all of the salary or like to remain at a very low salary level so as to become a comrade, then it is very difficult. And yeah, but at the same, so yeah, when we can actually ask people to think of an alternative lifestyle, I think it's hard. And also ask people not to, and also like even at the moment I was thinking, do I speak of, so I write about the book also as my own burnout, right? We are all in this very neoliberal academic world. Now, when we apply for one job, there will be hundreds of applicants graduating from world-renowned university. And also people that remain redundant in world-renowned institutions. And we think of our students as customers too. I mean, institutions frame students as customers. And so I was also thinking that in this world, it's very fortunate to pursue a world that's not burning out, because the world has made everybody to burn out. Like no matter what, like social position we're in, and all of us would just feel like no matter what we have achieved, it's not enough. It's the same life that we live as the businesswoman that I write of. To maybe our life is, I don't know which is more competitive, but for an academic life is also revolving around not enough. Your book is with MIT Press, it's not enough. Do you know like your colleagues' 2 books are with Harvard University Press? You published like 10 articles, it's not enough. Do you know like even your junior has published 18 articles in single author? And so it's hard to imagine a life that's not burnout, because it's a systematic issue, like, and it's only privilege not to be in a situation that I can write about it. And yeah. And also like to not think about just to write about it as something that's meaningful, because maybe it will not be meaningful. Maybe it's also me causing like cruel optimism for my students and others. So I think it's hard. It's a hard structure that we live. Yeah.
Okay, the final question regarding if you can give a preview of your upcoming work and maybe some other frameworks other than Hanbingchuo that you're using.
Yeah, so I think after Hanbingchuo, the book that I always recommend in any context is Care and Capitalism and Care. I think it's by Catherine Lynch, an Irish sociologist. And so the book basically talks about how care is a very good way to resist capitalism and capitalism assaults, or how care is made insignificant under capitalism first. And it's also like a feminist literature. I really love that book. And but now we talk about care also slightly too much, and also a lot of the discussions are not, I mean, are also quite surface in a way that, oh, care for yourself, all celebrities talk about it too. But it's not. That book is wonderful. And the new work that I work after I finished this book, first I start to do a lot of public sociology. So I was trying to do podcasts, I was producing my own music, and I was trying to organize and I was trying to cultivate my own community too. It's quite meaningful for very few people who are in this community, and I'm proud that I can bring something to them. And it's a very carefree community. We don't meet that often too, and we're not productive at all. But maybe it's the unproductivity that matters, because it's very free, carefree. I don't know. Our community is very unproductive. And also coming to UniMelb, I think the system allowed me to do a lot of things that are beyond just achieving, like in a sense of publishing academic papers. And now I think University of Melbourne also signed something that says that we should not value academics' achievements by, let's say, the journal that they publish, like Q1, Q2, Q3, or the press that they publish. Not many university signed this, so there are many problems of UniMelb, but for that I'm really appreciative. And so for my second book, it's a project called 25 Women That Shaped Modern China. It's a part of Routledge 25 Women That Shape series. The name suggests that it's aiming for like a general public, right? Because you can also even imagine that name being played on WeChat, public, whatever. You cannot miss this, whatever.
so funny. And each chapter would only be like 3,000 words. But once again, it's like facing the English, the English community. I'm finding a way to bridge with the Chinese community, and I'm still an active writer for Duan Ignitian media. And so I'm still trying to update my very unproductive podcast and very unproductive other stuff. So, and yeah, but with some conflict in the community, I'm also thinking that maybe it's a good idea for me to be an enabler rather than being in the front all the time. So I'm trying to enable people, students around me to do their own projects. So the new projects that I do and spend most of the time is usually to enable others to do something that they would feel meaningful for. Like so at Unimelb, I gather 3 students to do international student podcast. And so it's their podcast. I just ask money from the faculty to facilitate them to do something. So I feel like this is perhaps the direction that I want to go to. And it's also influenced by Li Xiaojiang, because she spent a lot of her years, most of her years, enabling other people to be able to publish their book in her series and to be able to document their small things in her museum. It's all those endeavors. So I think maybe it's better to be in that position.
Thank you, Professor Tao. I think that is the end of today's lecture and the seminar. And let's give a round of applause for Professor Tao Ling's amazing work and address to our audience today. Thank you so much for coming. And
thank you so much. I apologize for my nose again.
And everyone who is interested, please email Tao Ling if you have further questions or want to network